let's go ahead, see I've got my pointer here. Let's go ahead and finish up with the entire African realm, and then we'll switch out for the larger map of Africa where we'll be able to see the defined regions and states a little bit better. So let's go ahead and pick up with disease again. I like to go a little deeper into disease vectors and how they spread. Now, we did bring up before that there were epidemics that were regional spreading type disease vectors, and also pandemics. Let's talk a little bit about endemic first. So endemic, and this could be anywhere in the world we can have endemic diseases. So these are diseases that arise right in the location, and they come and they go. This can happen in places where colds and viruses come and go. And here in Africa, there are diseases that are endemic to different locations. Some endemic diseases might be hepatitis or venereal disease. And again, they come and go within the population. So when there's a disease that begins to move regionally over time and break out of its location, such as that with the tsetse fly, it's trypanosomes or sleeping sickness. That is what is carried by the bite of the tsetse fly. Sleeping sickness, yeah, that's something that really in the 1400s in West Africa and Equatorial Africa here is where this disease was born and developed over time. And then from the 1400s to the 1900s, it spread here, and so now tsetse fly and sleeping sickness, wherever tsetse flies are really could happen to anybody in much of Africa now. So that has become epidemic. And again, pandemic would be something that would become worldwide, and AIDS is a good example of that. So on the edges of the rainforest, the Congo is where that disease came from. And since it spread sexually, it's sexually transmitted, there's been a lot of negativity towards it, and actually in Africa itself where people don't wish to talk about it even. And so this has made it, people often will ask, why Africa? Why do diseases, especially why did AIDS come out of Africa? And again, there's a lot of negative culture already towards Africa, and as far as it being considered backward and uncivilized. And so AIDS really didn't help. The AIDS epidemic didn't help at all. Well, let's talk a little bit about why. Well, again, the social stigma in Africa against the disease being sexually transmitted would make it so people didn't want to talk about it. Also, there's not a lot of infrastructure, as we know, for the reasons that we've already discussed. There's not a lot of doctors, there's not a lot of clinics, there's not a lot of assistance for the medications that people can get in Europe, the United States. They can get treatments for HIV/AIDS where people can live healthy, long lives. There's some celebrities that have come out and talked about having the disease and living with it. Yet so many people in Africa don't have access to these clinics and doctors and medications. But just remember too, the stigma is huge. That in societies where it's just not spoken about, that's a huge part of it too, that people don't want to talk about it. And so that's a lot of that. But mainly it's the lack of infrastructure and the lack of medical facilities that makes it so very difficult for HIV/AIDS to be treated. Okay, so that's a little bit more to sum up. Disease vectors then, endemic diseases like venereal disease or hepatitis, which are come and go in the population. Epidemic like sleeping sickness, which is something that over time will break out and move. And Pandemic would be diseases like HIV/AIDS or bird flu that have gone worldwide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about language then. Okay, so language is something that is really a big deal in Africa. Since you can look at maps of ethnicities. If you Google search for map of African ethnicities, you'll see that there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little tribal zones of just many, 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 with different languages, different customs. And so we can break these languages down into language families. You can also look up the language family chart, and you'll see that it's more broken down. So in our realm here, I'll step away so I can point at where the languages are. We have the largest area is the Niger-Congo, which this language group would be the most widespread in this realm. We would also have the Saharan family of languages that would be here. We would have the Asiatic language groups, and of course Arabic now spoken up here, but that's a little bit, that's only really in our realm. The Asiatic group would be really in the transition zone. We also have the Malay languages here. We have Indo-European down here, and Kiosan here. So those are the major language families. Now, what has happened a lot with language is that language is so important to culture. You can't extricate the language from the culture. That now that many, many clans, after there was the divvying up of the lands and the colonization and the redrawing of the map into states, and then those states have all these clans and tribes inside of them that were determined, the extent of the state was determined by largely, well, determined by outsiders, and now need to be governed. Any one of those languages, if they're made the official language, the other tribes will rebel. And even if you take the majority language group, then the minority groups of languages those peoples will rebel. Or let's say you try to make it French or English or whatever trade language, same thing. There is often a backlash against that, and it's criticized by the local tribal groups that are there. So it's been very difficult to try to establish official languages.